It's the Awesemo NBA Preseason live before lock show. Greg Ehrenberg here, joined by RynPak, the peanut butter to my jelly. We had a great show the other day. It was so good that we're running it back. So nice. We're doing it twice. RynPak, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Greg. Excited to be back on this 7-game preseason slate. How's your Thursday going?
You know, it's going very well, but you know what would make it even better? If everybody who is watching the show right now liked the video and subscribed to our YouTube channel. That would be great. The thumbs up are great. The subscriptions are even better. So we'll say if you like the video, like it. If you love the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really helps out our numbers, helps people become aware of when we're going live if you hit that notification bell. And as for this slate, 7-game preseason slates, there's a bunch of games going on. One thing I think is interesting that makes this slate different from some of the other ones that we've talked about is this is the final preseason game for a lot of these teams. This is the final tune-up game for more than half the games on the slate. Magic, Hornets, Wizards, Pistons, and Grizzlies, Hawks. These are the only teams that are playing again. All the other teams, this is their final time playing before the regular season starts. So with that in mind, how does this change your mindset? Do you think these teams will run different rotations with this being the last time for them to get a look at guys before the regular season starts?
Yeah, especially for the last game of the preseason, I really pretty much buy into coach speak. I'll try to trust him as much as I can and go from there. Usually, depending on now we all know the season starts on the 22nd. Some of the teams have announced like what minutes will look like today. Sometimes I tend to give them a few extra minutes in my head thinking, okay, they're going to try to run as close as possible to the regular season rotation for players who are healthy and not coming off any like conditioning issues or any injuries. So I feel a little bit more confident just giving some players some extra minutes, obviously barring any coach speak. If coaches come out and say, okay, if I'm going to run like a 12 to 14 man rotation again, I'm going to have to like limit that off. But so far, the coaches have been pretty honest with us, and we've been able to buy into the proper coaches. So shout out to Stan Van Gundy, who was very good to both of us on Monday night.
Yeah, that slate was great because we had that information right before the show started that all the starters were going to play 30-ish minutes. And we actually got that to be the case. And then if I remember correctly, I mean, the optimal lineup on that slate it was just full of Pelicans players because those guys all played regular minutes and crushed relative to what we typically get from preseason players. So that worked out really well. And I kind of think we're going to get a lot of teams playing, not like 40 minutes or anything like that, but, giving guys regular rotations just to give them the final tune-up for the regular season. So for this slate more than any, I'm going to value more the guys who are starting because I think that this is going to kind of closely reflect who's starting to begin the regular season. And then I think those guys are probably going to be getting, in the neighborhood of 30 minutes. So more like a regular season NBA slate, I think there's actual value to some of the cheap guys that are starting. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with you. There are some teams that I'm a little skeptical on what minutes, like their minute ceiling might look like. But for the most part, starters across the board are who I'm going to be targeting. And obviously, there are some nice studs on the slate playing without some other high usage players that we'll get into.
All right, so let's launch right into it. In the first couple games, we do already have starting lineups. Hopefully we get more that come out as the show goes along. But first game on the slate is the Charlotte Hornets versus the Orlando Magic. Starting with the Hornets side, same starting lineup that we've seen from them a little bit, but there is one difference. We've got Graham, Rozier, PJ Washington, Cody Zeller starting, but the new addition to the starting lineup, who I know that Jordan behind the scenes is going to be thrilled about this because we've got one of the Martin brothers in there. We've got Cody Martin starting at small forward for the Hornets. He's actually been somebody who last year was an okay per-minute fantasy producer. So at min price, I think that he's a viable value option. If we could get 25 to 28 minutes from him at 4,000, I think that he's a guy to really look at there. The big difference here, obviously, is that Gordon Hayward, broken finger, Gordon Hayward, you talk about a guy who just seems like he gets touched and his body falls apart. With that broken finger, Gordon Hayward, he's out again. And now we've got Cody Martin in. So what do you make of Martin as a value play?
Yeah, to be honest, I think the field just might jump to him because they'll feel very confident in his minutes. But personally, I don't feel like an upside's there in a 7-game slate where it's going to be enough for Martin to take down a GPP. But in cash games, I can understand making that decision there. James Borrego said he's expects rotation players to get around 25 minutes. I could be wrong with what his exact quote was, but without Gordon Hayward there, I'm going to like the minutes. I like the price tag, but I don't like his upside. That's where I stand with the Martin, with one of the Martin twins that you said. but just a little skeptical on that upside. I think it's fine, but it's nothing great.
So, are there any of these bench players then that you would play over him, or you think have more upside? Or one thing I'll add before we go there: 7-game preseason slate. We've played a lot of slates that are 4 games, 5 games for the preseason. There's more options than we really have here, so I don't think we have to necessarily dig as deep as other ones. But still, just in the interest of talking about all these teams, are there any bench players here potentially, LaMelo Ball or somebody else that you actually do think has legitimate upside for a cheap price?
I think it's a fine time to go back to LaMelo Ball. It's someone that we talked about on Monday night, where I think the field might not be so much on him, and without those Gordon Hayward minutes, he might get sprinkled on a few extra minutes there. And we've both talked about how he can fill up the stat sheet. So I like taking a few shots in GPPs, but in cash games, I'm going to probably stay away. But I like LaMelo Ball off the bench. He's now under the 5K price tag. He's 4.8 on DraftKings. He's a DraftKings only play. FanDuel, it's a whole different ballgame where you need to pick raw scores by position. I would not be playing LaMelo Ball there. But I think on DraftKings, I think you can make a case for rostering him in some GPP lineups.
Yeah, we've seen some interesting stat lines from LaMelo Ball. So the first preseason game, he had no points. And then it was 10 rebounds and 4 assists. And last game, he actually scored a little bit, had 12 points, but then still had 3 rebounds, 2 assists, a steal, and a block. I think just in terms of counting stats, he's going to be really solid when he's on the court this year. I think he's going to be a guy who probably scores over a fantasy point per minute. So I think that he is somebody that we could go to. These other guys, though, Devontae Graham, Terry Rozier, to me, these are just not really high priority plays. Actually, if I wanted to go to one other guy in the starting lineup, I think I might be inclined to go to Cody Zeller at close to min price starting at center, because Cody Zeller, he's not really a sexy name. He's not really a sexy body or person in general, but he did sit next to my brother in a class once. My brother went to Indiana also, and they were in a business school class together. So that is a big honor in my family. That's a big claim to fame. But Cody Zeller still, he's a fairly decent per minute fantasy producer. And you look at him at a 4,300 price tag. I just think that people don't usually like to click on his name, but we've seen this before. When Cody Zeller starts games, somebody who pretty regularly is going to put up, a fantasy point plus per minute. So I think he makes for a good value there. And I think that people might overlook him.
Yeah, I think he's a fine option. I think you could go to PJ Washington potentially as well. And it's just that I think I like other players on the slate, other games where I think the upside is higher outside of the Charlotte players. I think there will be a Charlotte starter that's going to be good. I think maybe Devontae Graham is probably the highest upside of the starters now. That's how I feel. Do you have a particular interest in one of the Hornets players that has the highest upsides in just pure raw points?
So here's the issue I have with a lot of these kind of mid-range price players. When you get to Devontae Graham, 6,100, it's a somewhat significant price tag. And I feel like on a lot of these slates, we get enough value where it's just optimal to generally go stars and scrubs, right? So we have we have Luka Doncic on the slate, and he was really good in the Mavericks last game on a per minute basis. We've got Nikola Vucevic, who's generally played pretty well in the preseason. And it's easy enough to get up to these guys by rostering some of these viable 4K range players. Like LaMelo Ball is nearly min price. So we talked about Cody Zeller, nearly min price, Cody Martin. And it's not to say that any of those guys are like must plays, but I think if you get enough of these guys that score 20-ish fantasy points, then what ends up happening is it's just really easy to pay up for the studs. And those are the guys who kind of end up in the optimal lineups.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. And I think I just feel like it's an early game. People are like opt to be a little bit more safe. There's a Thursday night football game. People might not want to go back and adjust their lineups. And this game might be overowned. And there's some more enticing options later in the night.
Yeah. And I think there's also a point to that also. And we said this the other day is we only know the starting lineups as of now for the first couple of games. I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of fill in some of these later starting players and, the guard forward and utility slots on DraftKings. And you say like, hey, I don't know which guys are going to be the value plays, but I know it's going to be somebody who ends up starting in the later games. Therefore, you kind of fill in like placeholder type spots, almost like it's a dummy lineup. And then you just make late swaps to fill in some of the good value plays that end up in later games. Like we saw that with Taylor Norton-Tucker in some Lakers games where there was a chance he was going to start later, but we just didn't know for sure. And then after lock Anthony Davis, LeBron James up getting rolled out, he ends up starting and all of a sudden scores a bunch of fantasy points. So I think doing that, definitely leaving yourself flexible to making swaps when we get more of the value plays later in the night makes a lot of sense, as opposed to just jamming in some of the values from the early games.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think on the other side of things, on the Magic side of things, I prefer their players significantly more than the Hornets, and we can go right into it. I like Vooch quite a bit. I like Evan Fournier. I like Markelle Fultz. Those are the three of my favorite Magic players. I'm a little skeptical on Aaron Gordon. He did not crack the 20-minute mark last game out. Clifford has said in the previous games they're just trying to bring him back. But I like Vooch. He could easily be the highest scoring center on the slate, and that's going to mean a lot in a preseason slate, especially on FanDuel. I like him quite a bit, and I think Fultz can definitely get there for you. And I think he's slowly finding his groove. I'm really rooting for Fultz just to like prove that he's a solid NBA player, and he just had so much hype leaving college that he was the first overall pick. But I think things will come around for him this year. What's your take on the Magic tonight? Is there other players that you're more excited for?
So I know we've had people talk about and ask us about FanDuel, and it's always hard to kind of give too much FanDuel analysis because there's no value plays. Everybody's the same cost. You play whoever you want. So Vucevic, I agree. He's the first guy on this slate that is for sure FanDuel viable, the top overall center option, in my opinion, which isn't really necessarily saying all that much because I think the real legitimate options you've got Rudy Gobert, Nikola Vucevic, and Jonas Valanciunas. There's nobody else I'd really consider, but I think that Vucevic is number one for me over those guys. Totally agree with you on Aaron Gordon. Only played 16 minutes in the first preseason game and then was also right around 20 in the second game. So not enough minutes for me to want to pay up for him when you also consider that there's enough guys on the slate that are probably going to play in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 minutes. I don't think we need to go to Aaron Gordon playing restricted minutes. No interest in Dwayne Bacon. I don't really like Evan Fournier that much, though. I think he's not necessarily somebody you can't play, but kind of in that mid-range price tier. He falls into a very similar type boat to me as somebody like a Devontae Graham, where it's like there's not enough value for me to want to roster him when there's this many viable plays on the slate. But then getting into Markelle Fultz, I like Fultz a lot for a couple of reasons. Number one, younger player, and they've been trying to get him minutes, so I think that we're going to see him probably play close to 30 minutes in this game. And the other thing, too, just about him as being a fantasy viable player just in general, he racks up counting stats when he's on the court. Steals, points, assists, rebounds. I like Markelle Fultz a lot this year, and he's actually somebody who I've invested a ton in so far in best ball. I'm working on right now an article about the players that I have the most best ball exposure to, and Markelle Fultz is going to be one of those guys who is a mid-round pick that I think is substantial upside, somebody who I think is a late breakout candidate, and we kind of saw it a little bit last year, but I think that he's somebody who is, as a permanent fantasy producer, is going to be really strong. So him at his price point is probably my favorite overall cheap play from the Magic Hornets game. And then my favorite pay up option is Nikola Vucevic.
Yeah, and I think Vucevic is a very safe cash game, and the upside is definitely there in GPPs. Outside of that, I guess if you want to get really take some risks, you can potentially play Cole Anthony off the bench, and Michael Carter Williams, but no one really. That's a bit too risky potentially, but no one else really stands out for me. I think Vooch and Fultz are the way to go, and I like Fournier. I think he can hit some threes and definitely get you there potentially. But outside of that, this game is like not that interesting for me. Outside of Vooch and Fultz, and maybe one or two Charlotte guys are good, but I don't have the confidence to tell you who's like going to get you there.
All right, so the next game on the slate, and this one I think has a little bit more fantasy appeal, the Washington Wizards taking on the Detroit Pistons. First, from the Pistons side of the game, we have their starting lineup: Killian Hayes, Delon Wright, Jeremy Grant, Blake Griffin, Mason Plumlee. I don't understand why DraftKings is not pricing up Blake Griffin. I mean, we've seen him play, kind of close to normal minutes in the preseason, and permanent fantasy producer, he's by far the best option on this Pistons team based on historical results. And then you look at the other players in the starting lineup with Hayes, Wright, Grant, Plumlee. These are not high usage guys. So Blake has the ball in his hands a ton. He has a big playmaking role. And then he's also going to be able to get, as many shots up as he wants in terms of usage. So with that considered, I think Blake Griffin is one of the stronger plays on the slate. He's just not priced appropriately.
Yeah, I agree. And Blake Griffin's one of those guys, when healthy, he's a very, very good NBA player and a fantasy basketball player. So I'm trying to see if Dwayne Casey has said anything about what his game plan might be today. I'm trying to just catch up on some news, but Dwayne Casey is just one of those guys who I try to avoid in the preseason. And it seems like the minutes upside for Blake Griffin, I don't see him playing more than 24 minutes because Blake Griffin has an injury history and there's no really any reason to push him out there. But in 24 minutes, Blake Griffin can get you 30 plus fantasy points. And at that price tag, that can do some serious add some serious upside to your lineup. So I do like Blake Griffin for what it's worth, but I'm a little skeptical on what Casey might do in terms of rotations and if he's going to play another deep rotation once again.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing too is it's really just a price point play. So I mean, look at last game. Blake Griffin played 22 minutes, but at 10 points, 6 rebounds, 3 assists. So that's about a fantasy point per minute. And if Blake Griffin was priced like he's Blake Griffin and not priced like he's I don't know, Mason Plumlee or somebody else on this team, then there'd be a point where I'd be like, hey, I don't want to roster Blake Griffin at this price at that kind of price point. But just because he's so cheap, I think that's what makes Blake Griffin a really strong value play.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think his value can definitely help your lineup really make some nice things happen.
So is there anybody from Detroit that you look at and you think like, oh, this is somebody I really am confident in? I know you said in general you're kind of avoiding Stan Van Gundy because of the spread out minutes, but is there anybody you gravitate to as a strong play?
Correction, I think you meant to say Dwayne Casey, but
Dwayne Casey, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. There will be another starter, I think, that can get you there. I like targeting people who have the ball in their hands. I think Killian Hayes has yet to show that upside. I think it's there. Maybe he's having a tough time adjusting to the game. If you want to take a shot with Killian Hayes, there are some other people around that price that I prefer in the later games. But Killian Hayes, I think, has an potential there. But outside of that, outside of Blake and Killian Hayes, I don't really like much of Detroit.
All right. So, and then how about on the other side of the game from the Wizards? We also have their starting lineup. They are going with Raul Neto, Bradley Beal, Isaac Bonga, Mo Wagner, and Thomas Bryant. Wagner to me is the interesting one at a cheap price point, somebody who we've seen be a good per-minute fantasy producer. Also, the question with him is always how much run is he going to get? We've seen that in regular season games where Wagner starts and then ends up getting in foul trouble or something like that happens. He doesn't play well and only plays, like 15 minutes. Less of a concern in preseason where we're not really expecting, massive minutes from anybody. So what do you think of Wagner as a potential value play?
I'm a big Wagner fan. I mean, he went to Michigan when I was there. He took us to the Final Four, took us to the national championship game. So I always have a soft spot for Wagner. He's been good to me in DFS, and I'm going to go to Wagner again. I think there's a lot of bias in me that's speaking into this, but I know he takes up a center spot, but I like his salary. I think at that salary, it does open things up for you to potentially roster a Harden, a Luka, Steph's now above 8K. So Wagner can add some serious flexibility. And I think Wagner has an upside today. And if he's going to play 25, 26 minutes, I think he can get 30 fantasy points. I don't see a reason why he can't. So I like Wagner quite a bit.
So here's what I'm going to say about Wagner right now. Of the players who are priced around the minimum, so meaning 4,000, 42, 43, he's at 41. He's my favorite play on that price range of the slate of the information we have. Now, maybe we find out later, the Jazz game, there's, some random 4K starter who's a good permanent fantasy producer. But beyond that, of the guys we know of right now, Wagner to me stands out as the best value play. Do you feel differently, or are you a little concerned that people might just gravitate towards him because that's the only starting lineup we really have with a really high upside 4K player?
I think he'll for sure get some significant ownership now just because we've seen a starting lineup. The only way I think Wagner really fails your lineup, obviously if he doesn't get 20 minutes or gets in foul trouble and his upside's capped that way, is if there's two other centers who somehow put up 50 plus each and we're going to need those two centers. And I don't really think there's a path to any other center really getting you the value that Wagner can get you or the raw points. I feel like Wagner's very safe for 25 fantasy points. That's what I'm setting the floor at today. And anything higher than that is great. So it's not saying I'm advocating a lock for Wagner, but I think he's completely finding cash just because I want to get the studs in. So I think going back to your original question, I think Wagner failure has to do what Damian Dotson did yesterday. I think at 4K, Dotson only put up around 11 fantasy points, and that really ruined a bunch of my lineups. But I think Wagner can definitely catch a nice upside and potentially smash that value.
And then one more guy I think we should hit on before we move on is Bradley Beal making his preseason debut. Russell Westbrook's still out, but Bradley Beal, who was also out of the Wizards' first game, he's starting today. I find it a little hard to get to him in terms of roster construction for this reason. He is only, what is it, $800 less expensive than James Harden. And that's the next game we're going to talk about. I think Harden is a very obvious pay up option on this slate. So while Bradley Beal is okay, in general, the opportunity cost of rostering him is probably going to come at the expense of some exposure to James Harden. And I think Harden is just the far superior play. I don't have all that much confidence in Bradley Beal handling a massive workload. And this is the first game he's played all preseason.
Yeah, and there was word Scott Brooks said Bradley Beal will play a few minutes. So I'm not touching Bradley Beal today, and I would recommend not to. Now, if Scott Brooks decides he looks great and gets an extra rotation or two, but even then, the upside and just to pay out for alternatives like Steph Curry, James Harden, Luka Doncic, I just think it's better. It's just a safer outcome and much more higher ceiling. So I am not touching Beal today whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you there. Like I said, the other thing too is they're just the opportunity cost is really steep in playing him, because that'll transition right into the next game is the Rockets Spurs game. So we have for the Rockets, James Harden, who's getting absolutely trashed on social media after looking a little chubby in some of the pictures as he showed up. And then also other stories about him, partying and whatnot last year. I don't think it's all that significant. Like Harden's still going to come out. He's still going to be good at basketball. There's not this thing where all of a sudden James Harden's like thinking about strippers or something all basketball game, just forgets how to play, right? James Harden's going to be good. And the other thing to consider too, John Wall is out. DeMarcus Cousins is out. This is the Rockets' final game of the preseason, and they're letting these guys rest before the regular season starts. So with that considered, we have James Harden playing in a starting lineup that's probably going to look something like James Harden, Ben McLemore, Eric Gordon, Daniel House, and then either Christian Wood or PJ Tucker, depending on if Wood's healthy enough to play or not. So you look at that starting lineup, there is so much usage to go around that when Harden is on the court, he's going to be a monster per minute fantasy producer. So even if we only get 25 minutes out of Harden, that could very likely be a 50 fantasy point game. If you can only pay up for one guy, to me, it's going to be James Harden based on the other guys who are out of that lineup.
Yeah, we just did get word Christian Wood will be starting today. So he's priced at 7.3. I'm not really that interested in Christian Wood. There's obviously he's dealing with an injury. That's why he missed the first few games. But like going back to James Harden, without no Wall, no Boogie, he's going to get a lot of that usage, if not all of it. But that's mathematically not going to happen. But he's going to get a ton of that usage. And James Harden, yeah, I think he's living his best life. I can't really hate on him. He gave Lil Baby $100,000 gift or $300,000 gift. Chump change for James. I think James is going to be James. I think he'll be just fine, and he's going to be a great fantasy option tonight. 9-1. Yes, he's the most expensive player. It'll be interesting what the Doncic James Harden ownership difference will come in at differently, just because Harden has multi-positional eligibility. I think he's going to have a little bit more, and I think that's a big decision factor a lot of people have to make today. But I love Harden, and he's going to be heavily owned throughout my lineups tonight for sure.
Yeah, and I think this also, if you play cash games for NBA preseason DFS, people ask who's the lock. And it's hard to say anybody's a lock for preseason DFS, but I absolutely think you have to have James Harden in your lineup today for a couple of reasons. Number one, those guys being out. But then also we have guys we've talked to like Mo Wagner, and there's going to be other cheap players who are starting around that 4K price range. It's not all that hard to get James Harden into your lineups, and I definitely think that he's the first guy that you should be putting into a cash game lineup. I think you're making a mistake if you don't play him there.
Yeah, and with James Harden, let's say if you were making projections, do you think he'd be your highest raw scoring player of the day?
Yeah, it would be in between him and Doncic. I don't really know who else would be in consideration. I end up leaning towards Harden just because we've seen what his usage does when there's other stars not in the lineup. All those years when Chris Paul was out, we saw his usage go through the roof. Last year when Russell Westbrook was out, we saw his usage go through the roof. And that's basically the same situation where we've seen James Harden in regular season DFS. He's gotten up to a price tag of, I think, as high as $15,000 on FanDuel last year with Russell Westbrook out. So you just consider that. And obviously, we're not expecting quite the same sort of situation, but still, it's if you're getting a small sliver of that in 25 minutes or something like that, you can make a case that he should still be somebody who's priced over 10,000 even on a preseason slate.
For sure, and I think one of the Houston beat reporters tweeted out saying Wood will be limited to about 20 minutes, more than that for Harden, but nobody's playing 30 minutes per Steven Silas. So that's pretty important news to know. And so Harden played 21 minutes last time out. And if he's going to get nobody's playing more than 30, I think I'm going to have to give him around 25, 26 minutes, around that range. And 25, 26 minutes of Harden. I mean, he could easily put up 45 points potentially with this type of lineup that they're rolling out. That'd be a hyper fantasy performance, but it's possible. And if that happens, you're most likely going to need him.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think he was something like 1.8 fantasy points per minute last year with Russell Westbrook off the court. So that's definitely it's not an unrealistic expectation. If he plays 25 minutes, then you're going to expect somewhere in the 40 fantasy point range from him. I think that's perfectly fine for his price tag on FanDuel, because people have been asking about that. They're also, with salaries not in consideration, very easy to plug James Harden in.
Yeah, and then, I think there's enough value also to get him in with another stud as well.
Spurs side of the game, no starting lineup yet, unless that just came out a second ago. In terms of the Spurs, it's really hard for me to trust San Antonio in a preseason type game. We've seen Pop do all kinds of goofy things with his rotations in the regular season. For preseason, I just don't trust it. There's other guys I'd rather pay up for than LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan. And then in terms of the other guys, it's not like there's anybody who really stands out as being super cheap, viable play, just because I think they're going to run a deep rotation and a lot of guys are going to be playing, 18 to 22 minutes. So there's nobody here that I really trust as a value play. Do you feel differently? Is there somebody you have a decent amount of confidence in?
It's just, I think taking advantage of recency bias here potentially could happen. That's something that I'm going to be monitoring news up until that game tips off to see if anything can happen differently this time around. And just because they're the Spurs, I think there's a lot of people around the DFS circuit who think Pop might limit them and whatnot. And let's say if there's news that comes out, if they're going to play an extra rotation in the second half, I'm going to like some players like Aldridge and Rudy Gay potentially. And I think they'll come in low owned. And on a 7-game slate, I'm going to like a LaMarcus Aldridge that's pretty low owned and at that price tag. So maybe Aldridge or Rudy Gay for me. Devin Vassell is someone who's been pretty impressive, but I think some of those performances have been quite fluky in the sense he's picking up a lot of extra peripheral stats. So he might be like too much owned potentially, have too much ownership than he actually deserves. Outside of Aldridge, Gay, and maybe DeJounte Murray, I have moderate interest in them. I'm not saying that I'm ruling them out of my player pool right now. I have some interest in them, but that's barring news. I'm going to be monitoring that news situation pretty closely.
All right, next game on the slate, and we have a starting lineup for the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Atlanta Hawks. From the Grizzlies side of the game, they are starting John Morant. John Morant, why did I say that? I said it like he had like some weird accent there. Morant, Grayson Allen, Dylan Brooks, Kyle Anderson, and Jonas Valanciunas. That is the starting five for the Memphis Grizzlies. With that information, do any of these players really stand out for you? We saw with Morant in the first game of the preseason, he went nuts in limited minutes, and then the next game of the preseason, when he became a lot more popular because of what he did in the first game, he really tapered off and had more normal type of production. I tend to think that he's probably going to be somewhere in between what he did in game 1 and game 2 of the preseason. But what do you make of Morant as a pay-up option on this slate?
As a pay-up option, I'm willing to find those extra dollars and potentially pivot to Doncic or Harden or pay down to Curry. John Morant is someone who's been phenomenal, but I think that price tag is a little too much for me. So I know the upside is there, but I'm just trying to think of, I don't know what his ownership will come in at. It's really tough to gauge preseason ownership. But I think Morant might be a little too potentially overowned, and I think the upside is greater with potential pivots like in Curry, Doncic, Harden, even potentially Trae Young once we get to that game. Once you talk about that side.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think the issue with Morant is the price tag. So he is at, $8,700. That's a very steep price tag. And it's not to say that Morant isn't a good player, but just compare him to the other guys in that price range. Like you mentioned, Trae Young, James Harden, Luka Doncic. These are guys who last year were just far superior permanent fantasy producers. And so I think that all else being equal with these guys playing around the same amount of minutes, I just have to put Morant behind all of these guys, and it makes him somebody who I don't quite want to pay up for. If he was, $1,000, $1,500 cheaper, then I think we have a real conversation. But at this price point, it's hard for me to get to him. I don't really like him. Even on FanDuel, I'd rather roster, Luka Doncic, Trae Young, and Morant becomes more of a secondary option to those players. As for the other guys in the Grizzlies starting lineup, We've got Grayson Allen at 4,100. I think that he is a viable, cheap option given the nearly min price, and that we're looking for all his value to try to jam some of the studs into our lineups. So Grayson Allen, do you think that he's a viable value option? He is for me.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to like that value just because there's like a surplus of studs on the slate, and that value will give you options to rotate some studs in and out. I don't mind Allen. Obviously, the value is nice, and there is some value, and he's going to stick out. But at 4-1, obviously, Wagner, different position and whatnot. I would prefer to spend down like per Wagner in terms of saving salary. Allen is hoping. Allen is fine. I hope he doesn't trip anyone. Maybe he'll avoid that. But it's not someone who I don't think Allen can get you 30 plus points, where because of an absolute must need. But he's fine. I don't have like a strong take either way.
All right, guys, we do have a special promo code. If you use the promo code Caruso as a new Awesemo subscriber, you get access through December 29th. That's going to cover the first week of the NBA season. That's a really good way to dip your toes in NBA DFS. I know I've had a lot of people DMing me on Twitter and they say, hey, what's the best way to sign up? How could I get involved in Awesemo or just try out any sort of NBA product? It only costs $1. You get access through the first week of the season. And you know what? Maybe you do really well with that $1. You get the access to the best tools in the entire industry and maybe make enough money right there to just cover all the tools and projections for the rest of the season. So you try it out for $1. You have nothing to lose. And this will give you access to our projections, ownership projections, expert Slack chat. So if you want, you could go bug me and RynPak in there. You could DM me all kinds of whatever crazy things you want to ask about. You could ask about RynPak's drinking, what's over his shoulder. That's all the sort of special stuff you get access to in our Slack chat. So sign up for that. Just $1 using the promo code Caruso. I almost said Awesemo because it's really interchangeable, right? We all get Caruso and Alex Baker Awesemo confused. But it's promo code Caruso, CARUSO. Try it out. And then also, guys, don't forget, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That is very valuable to us. That's how we get people to know the shows are happening. And then you could watch RynPak and I occasionally drink on the show. That has happened from time to time when RynPak and I are together, about 50% of the time, to be accurate. So getting back to the Hawks side of the game, I think that Trae Young is a good pay-up option. But with that said, I have him behind Luka Doncic and James Harden in terms of priority. If I was splitting up ownership percentage, I'd probably go much more weighted heavily towards Harden and Doncic. And if I was just playing one lineup, I would go with Harden and Doncic and probably wouldn't have Trae Young in there. So I think that's really the lens that we have to view Trae Young through is how do you compare him to pay up options like Luka Doncic and James Harden?
Yeah. Trae Young, someone who failed the first game out, which was disappointing. So at 8,500, I think he's going to come in maybe a fifth of owned of what Luka, Curry, and Harden are. So that alone, especially in preseason and like in regular season, that's going to add some intrigue. And where we know Trae Young has an upside, it's going to be really interesting with this Hawks team. I need to look at some of their games and how the new additions are all coexisting. They're a much deeper team, and I feel like a lot of the players that they added are just like duplicates of what they already had. Like Bogdanovich seems just like a much better version of Herter. Gallinari seems like a much more better version of Cam Reddish. So all these players, how they're going to coexist. A lot of people have some high upside on these Hawks. Potentially, I'm not the biggest Trae Young believer. I think he's just so bad on defense where that's going to cause a lot of issues. But on tonight's fantasy slate, I think he's a fine pivot. And I'm going to be pivoting to Trae Young in some of my non-Luka, non-Harden lineups just to be a little different and seeing what might happen. It's a risk I'm willing to take. I think obviously Doncic and Curry and Harden are much better plays than Trae tonight.
So the other thing to keep an eye out for from the Hawks side of the game is that makes it hard to figure out the value plays. So Kevin Herter, Clint Capella, Cam Reddish, and Rajon Rondo. These guys are all questionable to play. Chris Dunn and Tony Snell has been ruled out. So that's something to keep an eye on too, because if a bunch of these guys get ruled out, then maybe we see somebody new in the starting lineup at a cheap price. There could be a situation where there's value there. But it's a little hard to make sense of it with all these guys being listed as questionable. With these guys being questionable, is there anybody as of now that stands out to you as a good value play, though?
On the Hawks, I think I like Capella. Capella he's priced in the weird center range, center price. He's priced at 5,500. And we saw last time out, he played 27 minutes, put up 30 fantasy points. And I'll take 30 fantasy points at that price range tonight. I don't mind that at all. And I think he makes for an interesting build as well. I don't think he's a name that many people are going to go out of the way to roster. So I'm trying to actively get over the field on Capella tonight. Outside of Capella, yes, you can take some shots with Bogdanovic and Collins as well. The upside is definitely there. But I think if you were to give me a Hawks ranking, I think I prefer Capella the best, followed by Collins, Young, and Bogdanovic. That's how I'd rank my Hawks in terms of priority right now. But Trae Young is just purely a pivot play. Capella, I think, truly is a good value play on the slate today. How do you stand on the Hawks? What do you think of Capella? And how do you think Capella is going to fit in with this Hawks team for the future with Collins in the front court?
Yeah, see, what makes it difficult is that Capella's listed as questionable for tonight. So number one, we don't know if he's playing yet, or else, yeah, I think the price tag is fine. If we find out that he's playing and is getting, normal minutes, then sure, I think at 5,500, he's probably too cheap. But the other concern here is with somebody questionable for a preseason game, does he play and only get, 18 minutes or something like that, where, they just have him out there doing some cardio, kind of trying to get in shape, stay in shape for the regular season. So that is one little bit of a concern for me. So I just feel like I don't have enough information with him being listed as questionable and us not having a Hawks starting lineup.
Yeah, and as always with preseason and NBA in general, just pay attention to the news, pay attention to our Slack chat, our Awesemo NBA handle. Give us a follow there. Our news, our behind the scenes news guide will be retweeting news from all various reporters throughout the night. So that's really important, and that can definitely change the slate if we get some news on starting lineups or any coaching notes that we can definitely implement into our lineups tonight.
All right, the next game on the slate, the Dallas Mavericks and the Minnesota Timberwolves. From the Dallas Mavericks, we've talked for tonight. Luka Doncic, I think that he is a priority play on the slate. If you're playing cash games, I definitely think you want to roster Luka Doncic and James Harden, and then you find the value plays to fill in around them to make the lineup work. So with Luka Doncic, he's somebody who played a little bit more in the last game than he played in the first preseason game. He got up. Is my audio good now?
I can hear you, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Jordan just said that nobody could hear me, so I wasn't sure if there was something wrong with my audio. All right, we are good now. Sorry for the confusion. Anyway, Luka Doncic, he played 29 minutes in the Mavericks' last preseason game after playing just under 20 in their first game. So I think that in that kind of playing time, that makes him an elite pay-up option. So just to reiterate what I said in case nobody heard it, Luka Doncic, James Harden, I think those are the two guys that are priorities that we want to jam into our cash game lineups. And then we fill in the lineup with some of the cheaper guys who are starting to mix.
And like going back to what you said, Doncic is a priority. For me, I can't pinpoint a second Dallas guy right now. Pick out. So I'm going to be like one of my highest owned players without a doubt, making sure that's a priority for me right now. I think he's coming in almost close to 3/4 of my lineups just because the number of lineups that I built out tonight. I like Doncic quite a bit, and I think you should too. And it would be so hard for me not to play him in a cash game if you're building one lineup.
And then I think somebody else here that's kind of interesting to take note of is
other plays, depending on your risk tolerance.
So I think either my audio or something was being goofy, or maybe it was lagging out, but whatever. One other guy, I'm not exactly sure you just said, but I'm not sure if you hit on him. Did you say anything about Dwight Powell? Because I think that he's pretty interesting coming off an Achilles injury as the Mavericks try to get him up to speed as we start the regular season. He is somebody who is yet to really play significant minutes in the preseason, but he get up to 22 minutes in the last game before tearing his Achilles. He was a very good permanent fantasy producer. So at his current price point, assuming that he starts, I think that he's somebody who's worth taking a look at. He's one of those value guys that I'd be willing to put in a lineup alongside Doncic and Harden to try to make it work. Do you have any strong takes for or against Dwight Powell?
Yeah, I was going back. I was talking about it was tough for me to pinpoint a second Dallas player who's standing out to me. I
think Powell or Dorian Finney-Smith potentially, but I always hesitate to roster Dorian Finney-Smith. But I think you bring up a good point with Powell. I think the problem is Powell takes up one of those front court positions where we like some other potential stud players and some better value options. But I think he's a fine pivot off of those higher on players for sure.
All right. Yeah. And sorry for the audio issues. I hope it's working now. It's been a little wonky for me too. I don't know if it's an internet issue or if it's just a YouTube issue, but I could say that's a little confusing trying to have a conversation with somebody when I can't hear everything they're saying back to me. But hopefully that gets ironed out going forward. From the Minnesota side of the game, Ricky Rubio, Malik Beasley, Josh Okogie, Jake Layman, Karl-Anthony Towns. That's at least who they started in the last game. We've got D'Angelo Russell is going to be out for tonight. So I'm assuming that's going to be the starting lineup is Rubio in there. Any of these guys that really stand out to you? I think that Rubio is modestly interesting with D'Angelo Russell out. He hasn't necessarily been great so far in the preseason, but part of that also is it's just really hard to figure out the Wolves backcourt because they have so many guys here that they want to get minutes to between Malik Beasley, D'Angelo Russell, Anthony Edwards, who's also played reasonably well in the preseason. So now that Rubio with D'Angelo Russell out, I think that he's somebody who stands out as a good play.
For sure. And I think Rubio is going to come in quite a bit lesser owned than he should be on a slate like this, just because people are just going to go and try to jam in the studs and where they take up the guard spots. Rubio definitely has an upside without Russell. There's nothing, can't disagree with you there. Malik Beasley is someone who I'm potentially interested in. Obviously a very controversial player with the offseason he's had, but I think he's makes for a fine option with that value. I think he's coming in the high fours, if I'm not mistaken. So Beasley is someone who I have a few lineups. He's currently in a few lineups of mine. Outside of that, Karl Towns is someone obviously who has an upside with more additional usage without D'Angelo Russell. So you can definitely go there. But Rubio probably be my favorite Timberwolves, and then followed by, I guess, Beasley, Karl Towns, and Anthony Edwards. If you were to say if priorities of getting the Timberwolves in, that's the four I would go. Do you differ there? And what's your opinion on Cat as a potential spend-up option tonight?
Yeah, I mean, Cat's interesting just because Russell's out, so that opens up more usage in the front court. Earlier in the slate, I was thinking about Vucevic as maybe the best center option, but now as we talk through it more and I really look at what I think the Timberwolves lineup is going to be, I think Towns with Russell out probably is a slightly better play. And this is something if we're talking about on FanDuel where, salary is no issue and you're trying to figure out one center to pay up for in cash games. I think now I'd probably lean a little bit Towns over Vucevic. But with that said, I still prioritize rostering Luka Doncic and James Harden over Karl-Anthony Towns. So that makes him more of a secondary play for me because there are other pay-up options that I prefer to him.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a very good point. I don't disagree with you there.
All right. And here, just to have a question here, expand on your Rubio take. So here's the thing with Ricky Rubio is, like I said before, he hasn't really played all that many minutes in the preseason. He also hasn't had the ball in his hands all that much, but D'Angelo Russell's out. So the reason that I said I really like him is there's a void to fill in that backcourt there. And the other thing too with Ricky Rubio is that he's not all that expensive. It's not like typically we're thinking about Ricky Rubio as a guy who's, a $7K player or something like that. He's $4,700. So we're talking about Ricky Rubio at close to min price. And with that considered, I think that Ricky Rubio is one of the better options for cheap that makes sense on this slate. That's really what stands out to me with Ricky Rubio and why it is that I like him.
Yeah, I think you bring up I can't say that any better than you did, and I completely agree with you there. So Rubio is a fine option. I think he can, if you're looking for like a outside of another guard stud, he can definitely, and he provides some nice value today. So no issues with Rubio whatsoever.
All right, 2 games left on the slate. Next one up, we have the Sacramento Kings taking on the Golden State Warriors. We'll start with the Kings side of the game because De'Aaron Fox, actually somebody who I'm pretty high on overall for the full season. But this is another thing also where we can't roster everybody. We could only select certain guys we want to pay up for. And De'Aaron Fox, to me, just doesn't quite make the cut when we have all these other guys. And I hate to keep bringing them up, except everything has to be talked about within the prism of guys like Luka Doncic and James Harden being on the slate. So anytime you're rostering an expensive guard or just an expensive player in general on the slate, it's always going to come at the opportunity cost of somebody like a Luka Doncic or James Harden. And you have to ask yourself, is the trade-off worth it? And to me, this is where I don't really quite get to De'Aaron Fox because I'd much rather pay up for Luka Doncic or James Harden. Where do you stand on Fox?
Yeah, I think he's an okay pivot. He's not like a fine pivot because the upside for Fox is nowhere the same as the upside for Doncic, Curry, or Hart. Minutes last game, I would expect somewhere around there as well. He went 6 of 13, 1 of 7 from 3. That's somewhere where he's been working quite a bit on the offseason. We'll see how that translates in the regular season. But Fox is someone who, like you said, the opportunity cost is a massive stud where I think you're going to need one of those studs tonight to be able to be profitable. So that's where I'm hesitant with De'Aaron Fox. And he has an upside, sure, but I'm very hesitant, not very confident, as you can hear in my tone, where I prefer Doncic and Harden over that.
So there is one value play I like quite a bit from the Sacramento Kings, and that's going to be Marvin Bagley, priced all the way down at 4,100. Bagley has been somebody who's disappointed both from a real life and fantasy perspective over the last couple of years, and a lot of it's been injury related. He's had a lot of problems staying on the court, but one thing we have seen from Marvin Bagley is when he's healthy and when he plays, he produces fantasy points. So I think somebody like Marvin Bagley, who's a young player that the Kings want to get run, they want to get him experience in the preseason here leading up to the regular season. I think that Bagley at 4,100 makes for another guy who's a pretty strong value play. I think this is one of these many front court guys who are priced in that low 4K range that we could roster without much issue and then get up to James Harden and Luka Doncic. So Marvin Bagley is one of my favorite value plays on the slate.
Yeah, the only thing that concerns me with Bagley, he had COVID-19, and Luke Walton wanted him to go back on the floor towards the end of the Golden State and Sacramento game the other night, and the trainer said no, not to. Looks like, and if we have any coaching notes before tip off, and if Bagley's a full go, I'm going to like that. His ownership is going to be really, really depressed, and that upside for Bagley at 4-1 can be really.
Can the chat hear us? I think that's what's more important.
Yeah, going back to Bagley, he had some minutes issues with his COVID-19 conditioning. He's coming back from testing positive. So the trainers didn't let him go back on the floor when Walton wanted him to. So it's nice that Walton's willing to make him run, but it feels like it's more of a higher than Walton decision. So where I'm concerned with Bagley's minutes is where I'm standing with Marvin Bagley right now.
All right. And then some people in the chat also want us to talk about Kyle Guy. With Kyle Guy coming off that kind of decent game, here's the concern I have. It's not like Kyle Guy is some guy that I project to be a great per minute fantasy producer this season. And I do wonder, after somebody who played well and produced a highlight like that in the last game, there are a lot of 4K-ish around that type of guys who I really like this slate. Like we've talked about Marvin Bagley, we've talked about Mo Wagner, these types of guys. I'd rather roster them than Kyle Guy because number one, I think they're going to be better per minute fantasy producers going forward. And number two, I think that the ownership on Kyle Guy could get a little inflated just because he hit that game-winning shot last game. So Kyle Guy, where do you stand on him?
Yeah, so another reason I was fortunate to pivot to Kyle Guy because we got news that they were going to limit Tyrese Halliburton's minutes, the rookie that they drafted this year. And I was like, okay, Kyle Guy's going to soak up some of the extra run. And he paid off quite a bit, and I think he was in the winning lineup that night. I think now is the time just to hop off, just because he had a buster beater in the preseason where there's not been that many highlights this preseason. So he was the talk of town for about 12 hours, and that alone it might make his ownership way too much. I think there's better options around that price tag. I think Bogdanovich on Atlanta's at 4.8. Bogdanovich on Utah is another option around there too. There's some finer pivots and with a higher upside where someone is starting, and like we talked about. And I think the preseason boxes are like, are they starting and have the coaches indicated they're going to get somewhat close to regular season run? And if your player's checking both those boxes off, I think he's a fine option tonight. I think we both could be stand corrected if I think we both agree on that. And I don't think Kyle Guy checks both those boxes for me.
Yeah, and also just to the point of what I said before, I think he's going to be a little bit popular. I mean, we're seeing it in the chat right now. People are saying, what about Kyle Guy? What about Kyle Guy? And you also have to think about how some of these biases start. And the fact that we don't really see all that much preseason highlights. We don't really see all that much of it go viral on Twitter. The Kyle Guy highlight the other day did, and that is something that kind of resonates in people's mind and will make people more apt to press on that button when they're going to make the lineup. And I also think that's why we're seeing him get talked about in the YouTube chat a little bit more. If Kyle Guy misses that shot at the end of the But I don't know. I'm just going to keep talking and see what happens. Maybe we come back. And I'm getting the thumbs up from Jordan, so I guess we are back. So from the Warriors side of the game then, we've got Steph Curry, Andrew Wiggins, Kelly Oubre, Eric Pascal, and Kevon Looney are the expected starters. I'm a little concerned with the playing time of Steph Curry, even though he got decent run in the last game. We think about the injury issues he had last year. I just don't know that they're really going to want to push Steph Curry to play bigger minutes in his final preseason game coming into the regular season, where the entire Warriors regular season is really built around, is Steph Curry healthy or not? So it's really hard for me to see Steph Curry getting extended run this final preseason game. That's what has me off of him. Are there any other guys here that you have an opinion on, or maybe feel differently than me about Steph Curry?
Yeah, I think it's safe to see Steph Curry get similar run as he got last time out. I think just depending, because they're going to be without Draymond Green again, and I think Kerr might want Curry to just get run with these new core. And Steph Curry himself has said it's been weird for him without playing without Draymond and Clay out there. So that alone makes me want to think Kerr probably wants Curry to get more familiar with his teammates. And at 8-1, you can make a case Curry could be the highest scoring player on the slate. Steph Curry has that upside. And I'm going to like that any day when I'm getting Steph Curry at that price tag and when he can easily be the highest scoring player on this preseason slate. So probably, yes, I do stand a little different on the Curry take as yours, where I'm will be a little skeptical. I think Marquise Chriss is going to get quite a bit more ownership. Marquise Chriss has lost quite a bit of weight, which is pretty impressive. And he's also generated a somewhat consistent three-point shot, which has been pretty impressive. But with Pascal back, I'm a little hesitant on the rest of the front court on the Warriors. But I like Steph Curry. And yes, I think you can take a couple of shots with Kelly Oubre and maybe Wiggins, but they're higher upside players that I prefer over Wiggins and Oubre on the rest of the slate. But Curry's I can say Curry's a priority for me right now, as he's coming in as one of my highest owned players.
All right, interesting. Just a few minutes left, so that's one thing that we differ on a little bit. I don't like Steph Curry as much, but with that said, if you were to tell me that Steph Curry is going to play, the 30 minutes that he got again last game, then I'd agree and say that I think that you definitely want to fire up Steph Curry. I'm just not quite sure that's going to be the case, but if he is, then I will be on the wrong side of that for sure. Final game on the slate, the Los Angeles Clippers taking on the Utah Jazz. From the Clippers, this is another team I just don't really want all that much to do with them in the preseason game. I find it really hard to think that guys like Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, who the Clippers have been cautious with in the regular season games, playing them extended minutes and resting them and whatnot. This is another one where it really makes me hard to think that really Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, of all the guys who play extended minutes in the preseason, I just don't see that being a possibility.
Yeah, and I agree with you. They are the definition of the load management there. And for me, it's going to come down to some coaching notes beforehand to hear what they say. And if there's some indication where they're going to get close to regular season run, yeah, I'm going to try to find a way to late swap into some Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. That's it on the Clippers for me. I really don't have interest in anyone else. On Utah, yeah, I probably have a little bit more moderate interest in Mitchell, Conley, and Bogdanovich. But if you were to say pick players on a team that I want to roster, probably Utah compared to the Clippers, as we're nearing 5 minutes to lock. Please do hit that like button for us. But outside of that, both these teams, I'm a little hesitant to pay attention to some coaching notes right before lock. That's going to be a key indicator how these players perform.
Yeah, so the guy who I actually have the most interest from on the Utah Jazz is going to be Jordan Clarkson. It's just because he's a guy that when he's on the court, he plays for your DFS lineup. He's going to shoot the ball just about every time he touches. He's not passing the ball to anybody. He's out there trying to score fantasy points. He plays like he rostered himself in DFS. So with that in mind, Jordan Clarkson, a guy who's also in that 4K, mid 4K range, I think that he's a viable, cheap option. We've seen him go off in one of the other preseason games, And it's not necessarily that I put a whole lot of weight into that, but it's more the fact that when Jordan Clarkson is on the court, he's going to shoot when he touches the ball. He's going to have a fairly high usage rating. He actually had the second highest usage rating on the Jazz in the postseason last year, just behind Donovan Mitchell. So, I mean, he's a guy he only has one mode. He gets on the court, he touches the ball, he shoots. So with that in mind, I think Jordan Clarkson is a guy, he's very scoring dependent, but if he's able to get some of those shots to fall, his upside is pretty substantial.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Jordan Clarkson definitely is one of those, I guess, modern day J.R. Smith type of players. I think J.R. Smith took him under his tutelage, took him a couple of tattoo shops and taught him how to gun, as in the sense, take a bunch of shots coming off the bench. And I do think Utah overpaid to retain him. I'm not the biggest Jordan Clarkson fan. I think contract year in the bubble, he just shot lights out and they thought they could use him again. I didn't like the signing too much. But yes, I think he's one of those guys who can get you an upside and potentially pay off that value. Not an option for me on FanDuel. We're in the shooting guard position where I think you should be looking at Doncic and Harden. Maybe Mitchell on FanDuel can get you as a pivot there, but just pay attention to some Quinn Snyder notes beforehand. Outside of that, right, I have nothing really else on this game.
All right, so that is all the games. So one last thing, let's just hit on, because we've got, about 90 seconds until lock. Give out, who's your favorite value play on the slate? And then I'll hit my favorite value play and close us out.
Favorite value on the slate will be Mo Wagner for me. I'm going to go to my Michigan roots and stick with him, have some bias, and have some emotional investment rooting for Mo Wagner tonight. I kid. But in all seriousness, I like Wagner at that price tag. Just because he makes me jam in a couple other studs that make my lineup look more appealing for a preseason slate.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. Wagner was my number one, but in terms of a number two, I'm going to throw Marvin Bagley because he's another guy, the 4,100 price tag, who I think has a chance to really exceed salary expectations just in terms of being a solid per minute fantasy producer and also just that really cheap price and being at the forward position. Also, that's going to allow us to get up to those guys like Luka Doncic and James Harden on DraftKings. These guys, obviously not people we really have to consider on FanDuel, where there is no salary. You play whoever you want, and they just say, who cares? This is how we play NBA DFS now. You roster whichever guys you like because we've thrown the salary cap out the table, out the window. So, all right, that's going to wrap us up. Don't forget, guys, if you want to try out our NBA DFS package, use the promo code Caruso for $1 NBA access through December 29th. That is the first week of the regular season. Also, like the video, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the notification bell so you get notified as soon as we go live. And with that, good luck tonight, guys. Jordan, play that sweet Christmas music out.